Okay, let's face it, if you're seeing this video, you have probably asked one of these questions before, whether you're a calligraphy pro or you're just beginning. Here are the 5 most common questions that beginners ask me when they're interested in getting started with modern calligraphy. First question is, what pen do I use? So first of all, there are tons of options here. There is no one right answer. And before I get even too far into explaining this, I want to point you to a free resource I have called What Pen Is This?, which is literally my 50-page guide that explains everything I recommend and why. This goes for not just pens, but like everything I use. So you can find that at thehappyevercrafter.com/supplies, and I'll also link to it below. But that aside, in this video, I'll give you the short answer. So my number 1 recommendation for a beginner brush pen is this Tombow Fudonosuke hard tip brush pen. Reason being that it's a small tip brush pen, which literally just means it's on the smaller end of pens. Compared to, for example, this Tombow dual brush, you can see that this one is a lot smaller than this one. The smaller the tip, the less flexible it's going to be, which usually means easier control as a beginner. This one is a great starting point if you've never used a brush pen before. I have a ton of other videos about brush pens and which ones are best for beginners, so I'm going to link to some of those in the comments too if you want more explanation. But allow me to just quickly say that if you're trying to do modern calligraphy, like I do and teach, so that's probably why you landed here, you just need to make sure your pen is flexible when you push on it. So a brush. You do not want a calligraphy pen or a chisel tipped pen, which actually brings me to the next question. And that is, what's the difference between a calligraphy pen, a brush pen, a pointed pen, and a fountain pen? So let's just clear up all the confusion around those. Okay, this is a huge point to cover, and it's a really confusing point for beginners. So let's look at all 4 of these tools. First up, this one is a calligraphy pen. It's chiseled on the tip, which means that depending how you move your hand, you can get thinner and thicker lines. So if you see calligraphy pen, it usually means that it's chiseled on the tip like this. These, as I showed earlier, are brush pens. They have a brush style tip, so if you push lighter and harder on them, you can get thinner and thicker lines just by adding and removing pressure. This is a pointed pen. This nib is pointed, as it says in the name, so you load this up with ink, and the nib opens and closes to let more or less ink out when you push on it lighter or harder. So if I push on this with my finger, you can see that those tines, those 2 metal pieces, spread apart, and that's how it lets more and less ink out. So when you load this up with ink, you can press lightly on it or you can press hard on it, and you can get light and heavy lines. And lastly, this is a fountain pen. It's a pen that has a preloaded cartridge of ink inside it. So if you unscrew it, this has ink in it. And it looks similar to a pointed pen on the end, except this nib actually isn't flexible. So when I push lighter and harder on it, it gives me the same thicknesses of lines. So now that you've seen them all, first let me say that all of these tools, calligraphy pens, brush pens, pointed pens, and fountain pens, can all be used for different kinds of calligraphy. However, they cannot all be used for the same type of calligraphy that people come to me to learn, which is modern calligraphy or brush lettering. What you call it depends who you talk to. That's a conversation for a whole other video. But out of these 4, there are 2 you can use for this type of calligraphy, and there are 2 that you can't. So the 2 that you can use for modern calligraphy, brush lettering, are obviously brush pens and pointed pens. The 2 that you can't use are the calligraphy pen and the fountain pen. Why? Because the calligraphy pen and the fountain pen are not flexible. So in modern calligraphy, the way that you achieve those thick and thin lines is by adding and removing pressure on your flexible tool. You press lightly on upstrokes and you press hard on downstrokes. So obviously, in order to achieve that, your tool needs to flex when you push on it differently. So the brush pen flexes, the pointed pen flexes. The calligraphy pen does not flex, the fountain pen does not flex. So the long story short for this answer is that when you're looking for tools to use in modern calligraphy, you want to make sure you're using a flexible tool. Brushes are great, chisel tips are not. So just because something in an art store says calligraphy on it does not mean it's exactly what you need to do modern calligraphy. All right, next question. What if my handwriting sucks? It doesn't matter at all. No, seriously, I know you don't believe me, but your handwriting has absolutely nothing to do with your calligraphy. They're totally unrelated. In calligraphy, every letter is built up of strokes. Here's what those look like. You have an upstroke, a downstroke, an overturn, an underturn, a compound curve, an oval, an ascending loop, and a descending loop. So in calligraphy, you take those strokes and you put them together to build letters like this. Let's say I want to do the letter H. I would do an upstroke like this. I would do an ascending loop like this. And I would do a compound curve like this. Literally all you're doing is learning those strokes and then sticking them together. And that's why your handwriting is totally irrelevant. We're not using handwriting skills here. I actually have an entire video all about this right here if you want a deeper explanation on this. Okay, next question, what if I'm left-handed? Great, you can still totally do this the same way a right-handed person can. It honestly just means that you'll need to play around a little bit to see how you hold your pen to make it comfortable and effective for you. And I say for you like that because it's completely personal preference. There are no rules when it comes to this. It's really just going to be about experimentation to find the right angles. A couple of tips for you though, from someone who actually taught themselves to do calligraphy with their left hand, just so I could be able to understand a little bit more. First of all, try angling your paper in totally different directions. In brush calligraphy, ideally you want your pen to be perpendicular to your page so that you can effectively get thicks and thins from the pen. But if you're left-handed, you might need to rotate your paper in different ways to make that comfortable. I've even seen a few lefties who write pretty much upside down. The next tip is to try holding your pen higher up. This puts more space between your hand and the paper so that you're less likely to smudge. And then lastly, try using a pen with a bigger tip on it. I can't tell you the exact science, but I can tell you that many of my students in my workshops tell me they prefer bigger pens as lefties, whereas righties prefer smaller pens. So whereas earlier in this video, I explained that the Tombow Food No Suke might be the best pen for a beginner, for a lefty, it might be the Tombow Dual Brush or another large tip brush pen. But long story short, yes, as a lefty, you can still totally do it. I've taught tons of lefties in my course. Okay, and the last question I often get is what's the best place or the best way to get started? This one's easy for me. Find an instructor you like and start. I'm going to keep it as simple as that for this answer and tell you that I actually have a completely free 90-minute crash course that I purposely made as close as possible to what I would teach you if you were at an in-person workshop with me. We go over everything from the ground up, including tools and everything. When you sign up, you'll get a downloadable workbook that you can follow along with and a full video to watch. So obviously I'm biased, but I think I've built it to be the perfect place to start and I would love to see you in there. Hopefully this video was helpful, and if you want that free course, you can find it at showmeyourdrills.com.